Conservation biology. Biologists estimate that there are between 10 and 200 million species on Earth today, but they are going extinct at an alarming rate. Part of this is because tropical forests that contain a lot of different species are being destroyed. There have been several extinctions, mass extinctions, over the last 540 million years, and it looks like we're heading into another one. Conservation biology is an area of study looking to stop this, prevent it. Human activities threaten Earth's biodiversity, and we're going to look at threats to biodiversity, but first let's look at what biodiversity is. Biodiversity has three aspects: genetic diversity, species diversity, and ecosystem diversity. We're going to look at each of these in turn. First of all, genetic diversity. This is the allele differences between organisms in a population, and so how varied are the different organisms within a population or between populations of the same species. If a population has a really big genetic diversity, then we worry a little bit less about it going extinct. If it has a very, very small genetic diversity, if the individuals are practically clones of each other, then we worry a lot more about extinction, because any change to the environment means that the population might not have the variation it needs to withstand that change in the environment. When we look at species diversity, we're looking at, in a particular ecosystem, we're looking at species richness and species abundance. We talked about this in another earlier video. Species richness is the number of different species. And so community 1 and community 2 here have the same species richness because they have 4 different species that exist there. Species abundance is greater in the top community, though, because they have pretty equal numbers of individuals within each species. And so species diversity would be higher in this first community. Let's define a couple of more terms here: endangered species and threatened species. An endangered species is one that's in danger of becoming extinct through a significant portion of its range or throughout its entire range. And a threatened species is likely to become endangered. And of course, an extinct species is one that no longer exists. Globally, 12% of birds, 20% of mammals, and 32% of amphibians are threatened with extinction, which is pretty terrifying. Ecosystem diversity. This is the number of different types of ecosystems that we have on the planet, and this is decreasing. So obviously, if you have fewer ecosystems, then you're going to have fewer types of organisms that can live, because there's not as many ecosystems. And one example of this going down is that 50% of wetlands in the United States have been drained and converted to other ecosystems. So if we have fewer wetlands, then we have fewer species that can live in the wetlands that are left. Another idea here is that local extinctions can have of one species can have a big effect on other species. So for example, this flying fox, it's a type of bat and it's a pollinator. And if it dies off, if it goes extinct, then the plants that rely on it will also go extinct because they won't be able to reproduce. Okay, biodiversity and human welfare. Why do we care about biodiversity? First of all, we care about biodiversity because we care about life. So most people care about killing off most other species that live on the planet. So that's one reason. Another more selfish reason is that biodiversity has practical benefits to people. So one is that a lot of our medicines come originally from chemicals that we isolated from plants. Another is crops. So for example, plant breeders bred virus-resistant commercial rice by crossing it with wild populations. And so if there's more diversity in more genetic diversity in wild rice than if you mix it or made it with commercial rice, then you might be able to make a more hardy crop. Another example is that a lot of prescription medicine contains substances that originally were derived from plants. So the loss of species means a loss of genes and genetic diversity, and we don't even know what chemicals there are out there in various plants because they might go extinct before we even have a chance to study them. Okay, ecosystem services. Here's another reason that biodiversity matters to us. If we destroy ecosystems, then a lot of the things that ecosystems do for humans is going to be lost. So Ecosystem services are processes through which natural ecosystems and their species help sustain life. So an example would be purification of air and water. So as water goes through the ground, it gets cleaned. And clean water is important for humans. Other examples are that nutrients are cycled through ecosystems and plants can grow when nutrients are cycled. And since we eat plants or we eat animals that eat plants, that's kind of important to us. Okay, so now what we're going to do is look at the threats to biodiversity. The number one threat to biodiversity that you need to know and memorize for AP Bio is habitat destruction. So there are many different threats to biodiversity: introduced or alien species, invasive species, overharvesting, global climate change, but habitat destruction is what you should memorize as the number one threat to biodiversity. Human alteration of the habitat is the greatest threat to biodiversity right now throughout the entire planet. Part of that would be habitat fragmentation. So if you have a bunch of organisms of a particular species and they're separated from each other, then if the genetic diversity of one gets too low, it can't mate with others of the same species because their habitat has been fragmented, and so they can't migrate to each other. So there's a lot more to this than simple, destruction of a very local habitat. Just one particular example of habitat loss is coral reefs. About 93% of coral reefs have been damaged by human activities. Okay, next one, invasive species or introduced species or alien species. These are species that humans have moved to new locations or new geographic regions. These species don't have their native predators, native parasites, native pathogens. And so the introduced species doesn't have anything to check it or to stop it. And so it often just, the population often just explodes. It goes up really, really fast. And while it does that, it destroys other species because the native ones can't compete with it as well because they do have native predators and native parasites and native pathogens. So these introduced species can be a big problem. So here's an example. The brown tree snake arrived in Guam as a stowaway on ships, and it led to the extinction of many local species. Another example is kudzu, which was actually intentionally introduced into the southern United States. Okay, another example of decreasing biodiversity is overharvesting. So humans can overharvest wild plants or animals, and if the overharvesting happens at such a rate that the natural reproduction rate is lower, then those species sometimes will die out. Organisms that are at particular risk for this are organisms that have low reproductive rates. So for example, elephants, as a result of overharvesting or killing off elephants for their ivory, elephant populations decreased. DNA analysis, you generally don't think of that in terms of ecology, but DNA analysis can help conservation biologists identify where various animal products have been harvested from and try to figure out what parts of the world elephants are still being killed for their ivory, for example. Overfishing has decreased our wild fish populations. Okay, next one is global climate change. And so this is only going to increase risk for biodiversity. So the hotter the climate gets, the more acidic the ocean gets, the more likely we are to have extinctions. So this is a huge concern. Part of that is acid rain or acid precipitation. So sulfuric acid and nitric acid from burning of fossil fuels and burning of wood has acidified rain. And what happens with that is that the acid leaches out calcium from the soil, and so the calcium is necessary for plants to grow. And if there's not enough calcium in the soil, the plants die.